And we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Schumacher, and this is it. We're on week 6 of Bible Geeks season 3 on the Psalms. So we've been going through the Psalms in parallel with the sermon series at the First Presbyterian Church of River Forest in Illinois, just outside Chicago. And we are coming up on Advent, and we are finishing up our series on both worship, and then we did a series on community and Thanksgiving, appropriate right now for Thanksgiving. Coming up this Thursday. Yes, Thanksgiving is on Thursdays. And we are now also at the end of the Psalms. And so, as we've been doing, going through a book of the Psalms every week, and we are making sure that the video is going right. And so, we're going to get into book 5. This is the end of the Psalms. So, what are we going to talk about? We're going to go through the same things that we've been going through normally. We're going to talk about the authorship or attribution on the Psalms. We're going to be talking about the genres. We're going to be talking about the themes, some of the key themes that come through within the book, select themes, I would say. And then in this one, I chose to talk about the concept of God's foreknowledge and providence. Reading through Psalm 139, I was reminded of a lot of the work that I've done on the concept of providence, the difference between general versus meticulous versus Molinist or middle knowledge, or open theology, and the concepts of providence between them, and to the question of, does God change his mind, and what can we learn from the scriptures? How do we reconcile what we read in the Psalms with some of the other parts that we see, particularly within the Old Testament, but also within the New? So that's going to be the topic for book 5, and we'll start with our bubbles. Okay, so authors for book 5. You can see book 5 here is actually pretty darn big. Book 5 goes from Psalm 107 through Psalm 150. So this is where almost a third of the Psalms are throughout the whole book. There's only 150 Psalms. You've got 43 of them in this one. So this is the largest book that we have. And you can see there's a whole lot going on. Remember here too, actually I maybe didn't even say, the size of these bubbles pertain to the length of the Psalm. So our friend Psalm 119 is dominating in terms of the size. But you can see there's a whole lot of Psalms in here, and you've got two attributions. You have anonymous, and then you have David. So we have this Davidic collection come back here, even though most of these things are not attributed to David. If you look at the chart there, you've got, you can start to see here, so 131, 133, but then, 138, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, and then 44 and 45. So there's a chunk there from 138 to 145 that's all David, and then a few others that are smattered throughout. So, in other words, we have the return of the king. There's Davidic block of the Psalms here towards the end, amidst all those others that are anonymous. It's an interesting question. As we've been going through, we talk about the concept that on balance, or at least in not quite this neat of a way, but we've been progressing through Israel's history through book 1 of the Psalms through book 5. So now we're in the post-exilic period, late exile and then post-exilic. What's a group of Davidic Psalms doing here in a book that's dated between the exilic period at the earliest, or even all the way up to the time of Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the wall in Jerusalem at the latest? So Hasselbullock addresses the question in Encountering the Book of Psalms. He says, since this book began with a major Davidic collection, there he's talking about book 1, it was most appropriate, in recognition of the psalmist par excellence, to conclude the book with another Davidic collection. So the idea here, if I interpret the quote there, the assembler of the Psalms, the editor, and there's some decent arguments that whoever was putting book 5 on was dealing with a collection that included books 1, 2, 3, and 4. The editor looked at the collection and said, it is only fitting to give David, one last victory lap in the Psalms before we conclude. And so the hypothesis there is that the editor took some Psalms that were Davidic, that weren't published elsewhere within the Psalter, and put them there towards the end of book 5. I will say this is not a required viewpoint. It's a scholarly conjecture. It's reasonable, but this is one of those things about Psalm studies and trying to discern, why did an editor do this or that? I carry a lot of skepticism about most statements about why editors did things. There's a whole lot of that when you get to gospel studies, when you get to people who are comparing Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular. It's called the synoptic problem, where they're looking at parallels between the New Testament authors and see where there are differences, and then they try and describe why, let's say, Matthew would tell a story this way, whereas Mark would tell it that way, and Luke would tell it differently, sort of constructing theological differences between them based on those comparisons. So much of that is conjecture. We are not ancient telepaths. We can't figure out what people were thinking or why they did it. In that sense, you can also see that I have not spent a lot of time on these sorts of discussions in the Psalms videos. Most of it has been on some kind of theological point, whether it's about lament, or about worship, or about the divine council, or about the ancient Near Eastern cosmology, or here divine providence. Looking at theology is exposed through the Psalms, as opposed to the either devotional reading of the Psalms, where it's very much get into the Psalm itself and feel along with the Psalm, or the very scholarly editorial redaction criticism that is often seen in stuff that in most commentaries that are written on the Psalms. I've tried to avoid that. I don't think that is particularly helpful because so much ink is spilled on things that there is absolutely no way we could possibly ever know. Unless we were to somehow come up with, letter to the reader from the Psalms, and there's a collection of them at each compilation that describe why they did each one. They didn't do that. And I've also avoided the devotional reading of the Psalms because that's typically what you get. And frankly, at least in my opinion, the devotional reading of the Psalms, some of these things start to get a little repetitive. If you were to open up the hymn book and you were to start reading hymns, you're going to see the same concept said over and over and over again. And you'd be like, yeah, okay, I get it. It's because the hymn book is not meant to be read cover to cover, as if it's some kind of narrative. Or it's some kind of popular book. It's meant to be, you open it up and you read one, or you sing one, you sing two, you sing three, and we cycle through them. The same thing is the case for the Psalms. So reading through the Psalms, I've been reading through a book recently. It's a collection of aphorisms, and it has a note at the beginning of it that says, aphorisms are a different kind of reading. It is best to only read 3 or 4 at a time, and then stop and just ponder them. I think that's the same thing for the Psalms. Reading the Psalms cover to cover is not going to work well. So, anyway, I've kind of digressed a bit beyond where I would want to go. But suffice to say, this is a conjecture. It is not a required viewpoint. After all, and for my money, and that which can be asserted without evidence can be rejected without evidence, both on mine and other theories about why this is here. My money is on this is in honor of David kind of victory lap. There's a scholarly genre called a festschrift, and a festschrift is when you read something that's dedicated to a particular scholar, written by people that have worked with the scholar throughout that person's career. Oftentimes it's former students or colleagues, but they're papers that are written about the kinds of things that that scholar has written, about that person's research interests, commentary on that person's papers. And this could very well be kind of a festschrift hymnody for David. I find that to be a kind of elegant explanation, especially now that they are back in Jerusalem. They've rebuilt the temple. The Psalms now, if you read Psalm 137, and it talks about, let me make sure I get the words right. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Psalm 137, verse 4. And I think about that in the context of, that's right before the Davidic block. How could we sing Yahweh's song in a foreign land? But now we're back. And if they're writing Psalms again, who better to honor than the psalmist par excellence? So, and I don't know if I'm actually saying anything that Dr. Bullock would disagree with here. But anyway, it's just noteworthy that that's there. There's a variety of reasons why that could be there. As far as genres go, we see a smattering of genres. This one is actually as well represented as you're going to get. I believe it has every one of the genres that have been called out in the Logos Bible Software Psalms Explorer. And if we could pull that up real quick and see, as long as this will drag appropriately. Back. So, yeah, if we go all. So the only one that it seems to be lacking is the one that they call trust. Yeah, Book 5 has representation in each genre that they describe here except for trust. So, yeah, you get the Wisdom Psalms, 119. We're not really going to talk about 119. The thing worth noting about 119 is that it's an acrostic. It's an acrostic of the Hebrew alphabet. Could have been a way both to, it was probably a mnemonic, a way to teach a whole bunch of things about Torah and about loving Torah and reading Torah and remembering that, all of those aphorisms by having it be an acrostic of the Hebrew alphabet. You can see lament, which is highlighted in many others, is a very minor emotion in Book 5. And you can see a whole bunch of those. This is 39, 40, 41, 42, 43. That's the Davidic collection. And in fact, if we go back and look at Logos here, if we look at, let's isolate Book 5, and let's isolate Lament. David, so 137 is the only lament that's not Davidic lament in Book 5. One of the things, too, this hymn genre that shows up, and I find it interesting. I really wish I understood the distinction that the Psalms Explorer was drawing between hymn and praise. I don't. But it's worth talking about here. The hymns that are listed are part of the collection of the Psalms of Ascents. We had the Korah Psalms before, we had the Asaph Psalms, and then we have the Songs of Ascents. And those are, aside from of David, those are your three major collections that you start to notice throughout the Psalms. So what are these Songs of Ascents? These take you from, if you just look here, from 120 all the way up through 134, and then 135, 136 are kind of this collected punctuative praise, which takes you to 137, and then the Davidic collection. We'll talk about that more later. So the Songs of Ascent, there's no scholarly consensus about what the Psalms of Ascent actually are. There's a widely held view that this is going up to Jerusalem. But going up to Jerusalem, ascent, Song of Rising, you might see elsewhere. That makes sense, right? Going up, ascent, okay, fine. Jerusalem, sure. What are you going to pick? Babylon? Going up to Zion, that would make sense. After all, these were all cultic, or at least not all, but the Psalms generally were used in worship, so going up to the temple, not a bad guess. There's a few ways to read it, though. Dr. Bullock is going to go with that the Songs of Ascent were going back to Jerusalem after the exile. So the way that he parses Book 5, and I find this interesting, I encountered the idea as I was going through his most recent commentary here, the Teach the Text commentary. That my camera fade really doesn't want to show. But yeah, Teach the Text commentary, Volume 2. The way he parses through it is that these Songs of Ascent are the return to Jerusalem from Babylon. So you have exile, and then return from exile, and then post-exile within this book. And in fact, if I find his briefing here on the Songs of Ascent, forgive me, I should have had this. Bookmarked before I started. We appreciate your patience while you wait. Yeah, so So yeah, Bullock places this as, their wider scope of the historical setting based on the rhetorical place in Book 5, their celebration of the returnees' long journey from Babylonia to Jerusalem, and in the recurring cycle of history. They were sung by the Israelites on their journeys to the pilgrim festivals in Jerusalem, to which all Israelites were called 3 times a year. So, Dr. Bullock's perspective on this is that initially they were the celebration of coming back, and then they became incorporated into the life of the pilgrimage when you would go to Jerusalem during the feasts, such as the Feast of Tabernacles. That's the view that's most commonly held, and that's partially because we know that's how they were used. Dr. Bullock goes, I think, one step further in placing a historical marker on the original use for them, which is a celebration of the return to Jerusalem. Since there are 15 of them, some people have associated it with the 15 steps that take place from the court of the women to the court of men in the temple, or the court of Israel. This would be in ascent up into that inner part of the temple where the men were allowed, associated with the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, something worth saying, in Orthodox Jewish worship, as far as I know, I think this is still true, they've always segregated men and women during worship. There's no biblical verse that mandates such a separation that I know of, but I think that's the case. And I'm actually using the handy-dandy, I Googled that, and indeed, women and men still do at traditional Jewish services have separate seating for the women still. So to get an idea of this too, just to get our heads around it, if this is the temple as it would have existed at the time of Herod, so this is, and I chose this one just because it highlighted these 2 different locations. You can see the women's courtyard right there. So you have the Gentile courtyard, which is on the outside. Gentile courtyard meaning what it means. In fact, you can walk through and say Gentiles, women. Now the men or the court of Israel is not labeled, but then priests. Those are related to who is allowed in those particular sections of the temple. So the Gentiles were allowed even outside the temple walls. That's where you could have, money changers. It's where you could have, anybody could be at that point of access to the temple. The part that's marked women's courtyard was not exclusively the women's courtyard. It was not only women here. The men could pass through the women's courtyard, but then the men would go up, and it's kind of obscured there by that chamber of oils right there. But where it says the gate of Nicanor, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, that was the gate into then the court of men. And so I put the steps right there that you can see that would be related to the Songs of Ascent going up there. So that's some people believe, and I'm not sure if this is true, but I came across this in the commentaries, that the Psalms would be thought of as you would say one of the Psalms on each step as you would walk up during the Feast of Tabernacles before you would get to the entrance. So some key repeated phrases in these hymns, some things to notice. The first is the theme of creation. So it talks about God who made the heavens and the earth. This is once again Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, the prelude to the Jewish prayer. Blessed be the God of Israel, King of the universe. God's creative attribute, the fact that He's the God of all the heavens and the earth. Creation is seen as a theme within these hymns. Eternity, both for now and evermore. So God's eternal nature is highlighted. Peace. This one I found really interesting because I think about the peace in the land that's described as a consequence of the Sinai covenant. That is when Israel is in their part of the land. They are not at war. They have the temple on Mount Zion. They have God in relationship with them, and everything is hunky-dory. That is the peace or the rest in the land. And so I found that interesting that was in there. I'm not sure if that's always how it's used, but that's what I thought of. Then the temple, the restoration of the temple. So may Yahweh bless you from Zion. Again, if we're talking about Mount Zion, we're talking about the return to Jerusalem and the temple that is on the mountain. So again, with the theme of return from exile here, that makes a lot of sense. Hope then, O Israel, put your trust in Yahweh. That's something that it was hard to do during the exile, but now that they're on the other side and they see their return, they're singing praises of trust to Yahweh. So, let's take a look now. Let's take a look now at the themes that we see in Book 5. We're looking at our word cloud. So, Lord, and once again, this is not the software that I'm using to generate these doesn't care about capital letters. This is the covenant name for Yahweh. It appears like 300 times or something. In fact, I could check that. I should check that. But yeah, the covenant name for Yahweh is used in Book 5 almost exclusively. So if we, I clicked the wrong one. I was going to get the quote for you on specifically how many times it's used. But that's the dominant word in here. Praise. Well, there's another one. We haven't seen that before. Praise as being the thing that's highlighted within the Psalms. Praise is the largest dominant idea in Book 5 as far as what the Psalms are talking about. Okay, if you excuse me here, I think I have the final tally. I opened up the wrong one. Interesting here. I was pretty darn sure. Hold, please. Yes, okay. So, yeah, in books 4 and 5 together. Books 4 and 5 together, Yahweh is used 339 times and Elohim is used 5 times. So that's the dominant word. Then you see praise, you see forever. We just talked about that as part of the collection of the Songs of Ascents. You see give, and then you see love. Love is actually pretty much tied with praise. It looks like the third, but it might be the second most often seen. That was not a word that you see highlighted in any of the other books of Psalms. So again, we're seeing the return from exile is eliciting so many new emotions within Israel that you didn't see in any of these others. And I honed in there on the word steadfast underneath. Because steadfast and love, when brought together, have a very specific meaning to the Israelites. Steadfast and love is the word chesed. So, well, love is highlighted. The term steadfast is right underneath it on this cloud here. And these two are often paired together. Steadfast love, chesed, that is the NRSV's translation of the term. You'll see just the word love. That will show up. But let's go to Logos here and look at the text comparison. Because I want to show you the different ways that this is translated. So let's Psalm 136, we'll pull that up. And yeah, let's look at the text comparison here. So this thing here that says text comparison should be working right now. Well, all right. So faithful love is in the New Living Translation. I really like that. I think that's my favorite. His love is eternal. Holman, You let me down, Holman. Steadfast love, I think that's good. Different point in time that would have gotten the point across. His love endures forever. Lame. His loving kindness is everlasting. That's a very good translation in the New American Standard here, but we don't speak that way anymore. So his love continues forever. His steadfast love continues forever. Um, his mercy endureth forever, King James. No, though that, I mean, if I have to choose between love and mercy, I might choose mercy. Uh, so his loyal love from the Lexham, very well done. Loyal love or faithful love are probably my two favorites here. I think anybody who's translating it as just love is kind of missing the point. Let's try. I saw the JPS there. Whoop. Oh boy. JPS. His mercy is the JPS translation. So, okay. So that's the different things that you see this translated as. Here's the thing about this term here. The concept of chesed isn't just love. It is the loyal love, or it's the covenant love. That's the best way I would think of it. That's why I like faithful, because faithful implies covenant. And we can see why it's important to highlight that this isn't just love in the lovey-dovey or whatever kind of way that we might think of the word love, or whatever meaning our culture might want to give to that word. What's happening here is something very different. And you can see that tension when you look at Psalm 136. Yes, Psalm 136. So let's look at that now. So the idea here that Hesed has to capture something that's more than just love, I think comes through when you start looking through Psalm 136 a bit more and look at what is actually being highlighted. Hold on, we got some light issues here. Cool. Yeah, what's actually being highlighted. If you look here, so spread out the earth and the waters, made the great lights, sun to rule over the day, moon and stars to rule over the night. Cool, creation. We get that. His love endures forever. Who struck Egypt through their firstborn, but overthrew Pharaoh and his army into the Red Sea. Who struck down kings, who killed famous kings, such as Sihon, king of the Amorites, Og, king of Bashan, gave their land as a heritage to his servant Israel. And after each one of these, who killed famous kings, his love endures forever. Who struck Egypt's firstborn, his love endures forever. If you're going to take the Barney the dinosaur kind of approach to love here, that's going to sound very bizarre. And that's because this is about the covenant love. This is mainly about the covenant faithfulness of God. And that's why mercy is actually not a bad word, because it's God condescending to the people, and it's him being loyal despite their constant turning away. So that's why I like loyal love or covenant love, because you really do lose something when you're just focusing on the love of God. This is the faithfulness of God. This is the covenant faithfulness of God and the mercy of God, and that is the expression of God's love. Loving kindness is another way of putting that. So again, this is a theme. God's covenant loyal love makes sense in the historical context of a return from exile. Yahweh, the one who made the heavens and the earth, has brought Israel out of bondage once more, established himself on Zion once more. Those are the kind of things that we just read through Psalm 136. They're praising Yahweh for showing his faithful love to his people and keeping his promises. So the songs of ascents, Psalm 120 through 134, plus 135 and 136 that we just read, or at least read part of, these are hymns of praise to Yahweh for his covenant faithfulness, associated with the temple, one of the symbols of this Hesed. It's associated with the return from exile. So I kind of like Bullock's, up through, Psalm 107 through 119 represent one idea, may even still be in exile. 120 through 136 are then this hooray, we're free, and return from exile, emphasizing the Hesed of Almighty God. And you get to 137, which is a lament about the exile, sort of a remembrance. We could read it real quick here, because it's not that long. Most of these psalms aren't long. So, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept, when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. But how could we sing Yahweh's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. There's parallelism there. If I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Yahweh, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down, down to the foundations. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. So there's a lot of raw emotion captured in there about the exile. Something about the little ones there at the end too. This is reminiscent of Egypt, right? This is the event that triggered the deliverance. But we see a whole lot of sadness and sorrow. We see rage. We see when we talked about the Psalms as being authentic emotion, it's not necessarily endorsing everything that it says, but it is authentically expressing what it says. And so this remembrance of the exile comes. It mentions Babylon by name. It's very historically rooted. It talks about the songs of Zion. So in the practice of psalm singing was there during the exile. That's the kind of thing they were asking for. It's very likely there was psalm writing too. And then, like we just described, there's that raw emotion there. Then Psalms 138 through 145, this Davidic collection, are an answer to that lament, reassuring the Israelites of God's faithfulness. Psalm 139 in particular emphasizes God's omnipresence and providence as reasons for assurance. And we're going to talk about Psalm 139 a lot. In essence, the point is that God was there during the exile, even when it seemed like he was not. That God can be trusted because God knows the end. God knows where this is going. Even if we don't see it, God knows the future. God can get us out of this one. So let's talk about Psalm 139. Let's go read that. Pull that up here. Psalm 139. So, O Yahweh, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Yahweh, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before me, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you're there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right shall hold me fast. Very quick. Reminiscent of last week, it's talking about the universe. You're going to the heavens, you're going to Sheol, you're going to the ends of the earth. Anyway, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light shall become around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you, the night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. For it was you who formed my inner parts, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance, and in your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God, how vast is the sum of them. I try to count them, they are more than the sand. I come to the end, I am still with you. Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God, and that the bloodthirsty would depart from me, those who speak of you maliciously and lift themselves up against you for evil. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Yahweh, and do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. In the word of the Lord. So there's a lot going on in this psalm there. This might be known to some of you as one of the most prominent scriptures that's used on the topic of abortion. That the psalmist is talking about how you were fearfully and wonderfully made. You were known by God when you were being made inside your mother's womb. Everything is being done purposefully, and the beauty of that life that's growing. And I think that's all definitely true and a very good application of this psalm when we're understanding it theologically. The point that I want to get into, we will get through using our questions. So, who is the speaker? If we go back, we look at, so we have an attribution here to the leader. So leader to the choir master is what you see in many places of David. So David is the one that gets the ascription in the Masoretic text. Zechariah is in the Septuagint. It's not really any real reason to go that direction. It's possibly taken from an earlier, as yet unpublished collection of Davidic Psalms. It's hard to know, though. This is speculative. Once again, this could just be something as simple as a psalm dedicated to David. We saw a little bit of the Davidic hint at the end here, right? Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. That's, see if there's any wicked way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. These are similar sorts of things that we hear in like Psalm 51, for instance. So that's very Davidic sounding for sure. Whether it's in honor of David or written by David, we don't know. Is it personal or corporate? This one's very personal. It's about as personal as you can get. This is like Psalm 23 level personal. So this is quite clearly a personal prayer that is being appropriated for corporate worship by its inclusion in the Psalms. What sort of genre do we have here? So again, praise, lament, thanksgiving, hymn, royal, or trust, which I didn't list because it's not in this book, at least according to Logos. This one's mixed. We have sort of this praise hymn in the first 18 verses, and then we get to a lament at the end. And there's something, just a brief comment I'll have too. This is partially why I don't like the chopping up of the Psalms that can sometimes happen either in devotional or in scripture reading or at the pulpit. I have not seen it happen at our pulpit recently. Certainly not in the past few years, but we like to sever off things like that lament at the end when we're reading the Psalms. We don't let the Psalm speak. We want to, force it into whatever categories that we have or whatever we want it to say, and so we'll stop at verse 18. It's sort of like stopping at verse 11 in 1 Corinthians 13. Love never fails. It's not even the right translations. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, as they shall cease, but as tongues they shall pass away. For now, as we see through a glass darkly, but then we'll see clearly face to face. The whole section, 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, is about the charismatic gifts and the fact that the charismatic gifts are elevated way higher than some of the non-charismatic gifts. Paul's point is that those are more important. Like, for instance, the gift of love. That's the one he uses as the example. But it's not about marital love the way that it's often appropriated. The context here is about the comparison with the charismatic gifts, specifically tongue speaking, which is what was going on in Corinth, and at least to a noticeable degree, which is why Paul felt like he needed to respond to it. And we sever that part out of that chapter because we don't want it to be about that. We want it to be about marriage, because, hey, wouldn't it be great? The same sort of thing can happen with the Psalms. We want a psalm to be about praising, and so we, get rid of the, oh, if you would only kill the wicked God part. But that's there. It's part of the prayer. Your prayers change genre, mine do too. And we should allow the whole text of Scripture to speak. So, yeah, like I was just saying, this is typical of our personal prayers. They don't neatly fit into a single genre. So, the purpose of the Psalm, so this is the question as to the setting in life. It is very hard to say anything specific about when this would be used in corporate worship. I believe that anybody who's explaining to you how it was used in corporate worship does not know what they were talking about, because it doesn't give us really any clues. I appreciated the honesty of Leslie Allen in the Word Bible Commentary. The basic issue, you can truly understand that this is saying a lot to talk about the basic issue of a cultic that's like temple or sapiential setting, so being more knowledge-based, is not easy to resolve. When you look at how much ink is spilled about when was this being used, and this person says this, and this person says that, and this person says that, this is truly the basic issue. because once you get to cultic, then people start talking about all sorts of ceremonies that they think might have happened based on their reading of the Psalms. And if they can't even get there as to describing whether or not it even is a cultic psalm, that's saying a lot for these scholars who are full of conjecture. So, purpose of the psalm, I don't think we know. So, yes, here. Everyone has different thoughts, none of which make sufficient sense for anyone else to adopt them. We can't even get past the basic question whether or not this would be used in worship, wisdom teaching, or some other place. Maybe all of them, who knows? That's essentially what that means. So we're going to move on to the key repeated elements. So the word know occurs 5 times. It matches the theme of God's knowledge and presence. This is either personal knowing or about God, the extension of God's knowledge. So God's knowledge of the psalmist, if we look at this, we have, you've searched me and known me. Okay, so that's like full present knowledge of the psalmist. You know when I sit and rise. So if the psalmist, it's not just a knowledge of the internal character, but it's the knowledge of what that person is doing, even in such banal actions as in sitting or getting up. You discern my thoughts from far away. So again, 3-tier universe, God is literally up there. To say, hey, you discern my thoughts from far away, that's God being able to look down and even know what you're thinking without needing to be anywhere around you. So it represents that God is sort of baked into the creation and has a level of knowledge that, the psalmist himself says is too great for me. I cannot even understand it. Even before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely. That one I highlighted because what that means is there is a future knowledge that God possesses. God can look at a particular individual and know exactly what is going to be said by that person in the future. So if God knows what you're going to say before you know what you're going to say, there is not just the full present knowledge. You've searched me and known me. You know when I sit and rise. You discern my thoughts from far away. But you also know something about me that I don't even know in the future. Your knowledge is too high to attain. God is present in every part of creation. Then in your book were written all the days that were formed for me when none of them yet existed. This one is a really special passage, I would say, on the particular idea of providence. So this idea that God had written down, not literally written down, this is metaphorical language, but it's sort of saying that it is definite. In your book were written, when we consider something that's like written in a book, like this one here, these words aren't going to change. They are printed on the page, and whatever happens to this printed document, you're not going to be able to go and like erase a word and rewrite something else. This is a static document. Once it has been created, it's been created, and it's going to look like this forever. Books, once it is written down, it is considered definite, and you can. That's part of the reason that books exist. So you can take a set of thoughts and transfer them and have the perfect representation of that language at some other place. You don't have to be with another person. The book can carry those particular pieces of communication with it in a static, unchanging way across time and space. That's the point of books. The Gutenberg revolution was one that you could then disseminate those very quickly. And then I would say another one, if you're watching this on YouTube, the problem with books is that when you're using written word, you miss out on a whole lot of communication. Verbal communication tends to be, for most people, far more comprehensible than written communication. There's also just a whole bunch of things that are communicated using context and vocal inflection that can't be done via the written word. Now that YouTube has disseminated such that it's even easier to obtain communication through your phone than it is through a written book, because you have to go, it's finding the physical book is now the difficult thing. It's more difficult than getting content on your phone. You get something delivered to you right away when I send the email out with the link here. But it used to be that the book was the only way that you could obtain communication over space and time that would be consistent. So it is pretty incredible, just as an aside, the revolution that's happening in human communication now with instant delivery of video content. But if we go back to the world of the psalmist, so in your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them yet existed. So this was defined before the days existed. So this is a really interesting commentary on God's knowledge. In theologian speak, this is called exhaustive, definite foreknowledge of all future contingent events. In plain English, it's called God knows everything, past, present, and future. And so the question, do we believe that this is the teaching of Scripture? I think, I would expect that my audience here, yes, we would say so. This is the classical view. I expect almost all people that are encountering this, given the size of the audience, I would expect all people encountering this likely hold this viewpoint. There's some disagreement about how or why God knows the future, though. And this is something that I found particularly interesting. So there's the classical views of God's foreknowledge. There's the first one, simple foreknowledge, which is being outside time. God knows all things as an observer. So God looks down the corridors of time, so to speak, upon creation. He sees all things as if he's on a mountain watching below. So if you are on the ground, you can only see what your field of vision is. If you go up to the top of a mountain, though, you can see, just think of like armies. You can see an army approaching from miles away that people on the other side don't know is coming because there's a forest in the way or there's a mound in the way or something. So you have so much more knowledge being outside of that particular event, instead being elevated up, that your perspective is different. And the difference in perspective allows you to perceive events that you can't perceive on the ground. So that analogy is then just extended to God. God is outside time, and so God beholds all that happens in time from this zoomed out perspective. The same way that you will see people on one side of a mountain and another side of a mountain from the top who have no chance or understanding whatsoever that each other are there, so does God see time. God then intervenes to accomplish his purposes, but does not otherwise force free will decisions of human beings. So the simple foreknowledge view, and this would be the view held by Wesleyan Arminian, this would be the view held by Roman Catholics, is that there aren't defined decisions being made for humans except in very limited circumstances. The other view, the other classical view, I would say, would be the idea of meticulous providence. God knows all things because he decreed all things. So every action that takes place in time is the result of God's specific command, essentially, that it would happen. This is captured in the Westminster Confession of Faith. So it's a very famous quote. God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet so is thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. That second part will become important later, but that first sentence there, God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass, is that idea of meticulous providence. So the simple foreknowledge view is just, as a matter of perspective, God knows all things. The Westminster view, the meticulous providence view, God did freely, God's freedom, and unchangeably ordain, so without any change, almost like it's written in the book, whatever happens. All things that happen are the result of God's decree. So these are the views of foreknowledge. It'll probably be interesting in class to talk about those a little bit, but let's talk about where this gets tough, because it's Bible Geeks. You knew it couldn't be that easy. The ensuing examples, the ones that I'm choosing to highlight, are used by Gregory Boyd in his lecture on the open view of God. More on that later. But I want to go through some of these examples first, because we don't need to interpret these examples in the light of open theism. We just have to deal with the biblical data no matter what. So, despite what we just said about foreknowledge, whether it's passive foreknowledge or decreed foreknowledge, God does seem to regret things. For instance, in Genesis 6 through 7, and the Lord was sorry that he made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So Yahweh said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings that I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and the birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. So God did something and then was sorry for it. 1 Samuel 15, I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me. And the Lord was sorry that he made Saul king over Israel. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things to say, okay, if you knew it was going to happen from all eternity, or you decreed that it was going to happen from all eternity, how is it that you can say, I regret that I made Saul king? That sounds like, how do you regret something that you sovereignly decreed would happen? If you also have perfect knowledge of everything. So, if you decreed every action, you decreed that Saul would be king, you then decreed what Saul would do, and the idea that you would regret that when you could have just changed it doesn't make any sense. From the simple foreknowledge view, how is it that you regret something that was freely done? If you had perfect knowledge of the future, you should have just not done it. You should have not made Saul king because you had perfect foreknowledge of all future events. Recall what it was said, in your book were written all the days that were formed for me when none of them yet existed. So if that's the case, if all the days of Saul were written before they existed, then how is it that God regrets making Saul king? God also sometimes seems surprised. So Jeremiah chapter 3, and this is talking about Judah. And I thought, after she, that's Judah, has done all this, she will return to me, but she did not return. Sorry, this is Israel, forgive me. And her false sister Judah saw it. And I thought how I would set you among my children, and give you pleasant land, the most beautiful heritage of all the nations. And I thought you would call me my father, would not turn from following me, but instead, as a faithless wife leaves her husband, so you have been faithless to me, O house of Israel, says Yahweh. So the marriage analogy coming up, saying, I thought that, essentially, after the covenant, you would be faithful, but you weren't. So you see this, I thought this, but I thought this, and I thought you would do this, but instead you did that. God seems to be expressing surprise. Again, if you have perfect foreknowledge of all future events, whether it's passive or from a decree, how are you surprised? It would be the question. Especially from the decree angle. Here's another one, Isaiah chapter 5. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. Once again, this is the analogy for Israel. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. So, I did everything I could for the vineyard, and I wanted it to yield fruit, but it didn't yield good fruit. And so now I have to do something different. This seems to imply that God's surprised by what happened there. Then there's the idea that God tests people to know things about them. The best example here, Genesis 22. What does God say about the almost sacrifice of Isaac? So God sends Abraham and Isaac out. Excuse me. God tells Abraham to go sacrifice Isaac. And then God stays Abraham's hand right before he does sacrifice Isaac, and provides a lamb, and then says, for now I know that you fear God. Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the heaven and the sand that is on the seashore. It sure seems here like this was a contingent event. God says, now I know you fear me, and because you've done this, now I will do something else. So that act somehow proved something that God needed to know about Abraham's character, is the way that it reads. God sometimes uses if statements, such as the Lord decided against leading Israel along the shortest route to Canaan, because Israel might have had to fight the Philistines and thought if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. That almost makes it sound contingent, that God is saying, okay, we're not going to go that way because that could be bad. They might run back to Egypt, which implies that it's not written definitely that they will go to Mount Sinai, that somehow God had to route them around, and the Lord thought if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. And that might even invoke some indefinites. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Who knows? God also then, famously, seems like God changes his mind. Exodus 32, 9 through 11. Actually, we'll read the whole thing here. We'll bring Logos back. Okay. So, where did I say in here? I said starting in 9. Now, we should read back through 7. So Yahweh said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf, have worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' Yahweh said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And of you I will make a great nation.'" By there he's saying, okay, you know what, never mind. Descendants of Abraham, all of them except for Moses, we're going to wipe out. You're going to be the great nation now. But Moses implored Yahweh his God and said, "Yahweh, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Jacob, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of the heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.'" Then Yahweh changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on the people. It doesn't seem to leave much room for equivocation there, right? Yahweh says, "Stand back. It's going to get hot." And then Moses says, "Remember you promised?" And Yahweh relents. It seems like God changes his mind. If everything is defined in the future, how do you read that text and then come away with the idea that the future is exhaustively determined or at least known? Jeremiah chapter 18. "At one moment I may declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will pluck it up and break down and destroy it. But if the nation concerning which I have spoken turns from its evil, I will change my mind about the disaster I intended to bring on it." So this appears contingent, right? I don't know if I'm going to. At one moment I might do this, but then I might change my mind. It's what happened with Israel in Exodus 32. And then Abraham and God in Genesis 18 regarding Sodom and Gomorrah. Would you spare the city for 10 righteous? Would you spare the city for 5 righteous? It seems like there's some bargaining going on. All right, so what do we make all of this? How do we understand? All of that scripture that we just read. And again, I think this will be an interesting discussion point in the class this evening. We're going to look a little bit at some of the recent answers by some theologians. They may surprise you. Some newer perspectives on foreknowledge that get at this a little bit. One of them is called middle knowledge. This is also called Molinism, after Louis de Molina, a Roman Catholic monk who's responsible with coming up with the system. This would be... what's interesting is that Molinism was derived sort of from a commission to come up with a model of providence that was not the Reformed model of meticulous providence. So somehow go reconcile free will and meticulous providence was essentially Molina's task. And he comes up with the doctrine of middle knowledge. Here's the idea. Before creation, God knew all possible worlds in which there were creatures with libertarian freedom. God created the world that achieved his ends to the maximum possibility. So, God is infinitely intelligent, and God essentially was able to look at all possible outcomes. If humans were to be created, what is every possible universe that could exist in theory, given human beings or given the universe? With every conceivable possibility, God chooses the one that God prefers the most. I've heard it said, and I think this takes the logic one step further. I think it's totally fine. I prefer my more conservative formulation, but this was from a prominent Molinist who said God chose the world in which the maximum amount of people were saved. So in that sense, God has saved his people. God actually decreed, God has meticulously decided every action that will happen, though in some cases by reluctance or tacit approval. God didn't say this, then this, then this, then this, but said, I choose this world and everything that goes in it, balancing the risk and reward. Actually, there's not risk. Sorry, middle knowledge contains no risk. Balancing the good and the bad. So God did decree everything that happened in time, but every decision that's made is made freely within this particular universe. So all of the actions are freely taken, but God decreed the universe, so God also exercised specific providence. You might find, so William Lane Craig, he's one of the most prominent Christian apologists today. He would be a modern advocate of the middle knowledge position. So it is very philosophically clever. In class, I'll ask the question, what do we think of this? What's the reaction? I think the interesting reaction to this one is, here, I've got some cards here. Here's a good analogy. So if I've got roughly 13 cards here, I have 12. So here, almost a full hand. Cool. If you take a look at this hand right here, I'm going to go ahead and organize this and show it to the camera. Think of this hand as this is the universe of possibilities that you're dealing with. Okay? God essentially has a defined set of possible universes that he can work with. So somebody throws out a card. If we're playing bridge, somebody throws out a card. I can choose whichever one of these cards is the most likely or the best one to play in this given situation. You may or may not be able to see because of the camera blur. Every single card here is a number card. There's actually nothing higher than a 10 on here. Here's what that means. God plays the 10, so to speak, and says, this is the best play that I can make given this set of universes. So God has sovereignly decreed it, but he didn't decree that he would have the hand like this. God has to play the hand he's dealt in the middle knowledge position, which is the set of possible universes in which there are human beings and everything that it means to be a human, which means that there's some other property or some other source for the nature of human beings that is not God. God can't reformulate human beings in this idea. Humans and human will, so to speak, are a given. So if God is to play the cards he's dealt, the rejoinder would be, I would like to worship the God who dealt the hand, because that's the one who's really God. So that would be the criticism of Molinism, is that it actually robs God of the primary agency of being unconstrained, being able to create anything. It provides constraints upon God. Aside from that, it's very clever and frankly, tempting, except for the fact that it assumes constraints on God that do not exist scripturally. So here's another one. We're going to spend some time on this one. Openness theology, or open theism as it's called. I hear few open theists call themselves open theists. They will say they're advocates of the openness perspective, or they have an open view of providence, or a general view of providence, or an open view of the future. So it would go like this. God is an infinitely intelligent being with complete and exhaustive knowledge of all events past and present, and they'll just cross out the words and future. So, in other words, the God of open theism does not know a definite future. There is not definite foreknowledge of the future because the future is not definite. Open theism sees God as sort of the divine chess master, calculates probabilities perfectly, but since the future does not exist, it was not decreed, it is unknown to God. So, if we consider actually, the comparison won't work. The chess master example is probably the best one, where a chess master said, this is an analogy used by Gregory Boyd, to be able to predict like up to 15 or 16 moves in the future. Chess novice can do 3. Playing chess against God is that God knows and can consider and cognitively sort through all possible moves that God's opponent in chess could make. And so God knows the maximally optimal move to make in every single situation, but God does not know which path is going to be taken in the future. So God will make a move, then the other side makes a move. God can infinitely and fully accurately recalculate all possibilities and make the maximum optimal move next. So there is no determined future, though God knows all possible futures. This would be the similarity to open theism. Both of them know all possible futures. The difference is, in Molinism, all possible futures are known and one is actuated, one is created. Whereas in open theism, the all possible futures, God does not decree the creation of a particular universe because the future just ontologically doesn't work like that. You can't actually make a future. It requires free actions. I'm not sure if I explained that great, but the chess master example will hold. An example of that, another one that Greg Boyd uses, is a choose your own adventure book. God is the choose your own adventure book. The author knows what's written on every single page. So the author of a choose your own adventure book knows all possible paths that can be taken, but does not know which path a particular reader is going to take. So God knows exhaustively all future possibilities, and so they would say God knows the future, but God doesn't know what future is going to be the real future. And so God is learning along the way. God is reacting to things in time. So that would be the idea of openness theology. Greg Boyd, Clark Pinnock, John Sanders would be 3 of the most famous advocates for this position. So here's some questions that we need to ask of the openness position. If I back up, let me ask this. What's good about the openness position? The openness position makes full sense of all those texts that we went through before. That's generally where they're going to come from. The openness position is going to say, yes, God can change his mind, God can regret things, God can be surprised, God can use if statements and do so authentically. And so they're deriving the theology from the idea that battery of texts exists. And they're trying to make sense of it. This is truly an emergent theology. I want to give them credit for some intellectual honesty here, that they really are trying to work with biblical data. And they're looking at the data, and the people who advocate the openness position say that they believe that the evidence is stronger, that there's an open view of God, than that these other texts represent a definite future. So they could handle all those texts with ease. And in fact, it's because of those texts that the theology developed. The questions we need to ask reciprocally, though, are what would happen if God did not know the future with certainty? How could you say, such as in Isaiah 15, I have aroused Cyrus in righteousness. I will make all his paths straight. He shall build my city and set my exiles free, not for price or reward, says the Lord of heaven's armies, Yahweh Sabaoth. This is in the middle of Isaiah 40 through 48. This is during the exile. This is a prediction of Cyrus. This part of Isaiah 2 would be written hundreds of years beforehand. So hundreds of years before Cyrus is even born, much less everything that happens during Cyrus's life, the hundreds of thousands of free will decisions that would have to be made in order to create a Cyrus as a king who would have the army necessary to go to Babylon, and also the exile would occur. And the exile is going to happen in the following way, and that Cyrus is going to be the one to free them. To make this kind of statement, there already has to be essentially a definite future for Israel. Or is it, well, whenever they get exiled, I don't know when that's going to be, but I'll find a dude named Cyrus and we'll work it out. Like, that doesn't make any sense. This is a definite statement that he shall, not for price or reward, he will set my people free. I will make his paths straight, meaning I will essentially, if his paths are going to be straight, God is going to intervene to do that, sort of like God hardens Pharaoh's heart. How about this? Truly I tell you, this very night before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, even though I must die with you, I will not deny you. This one, I think, is as close to a knockdown argument against the openness perspective as you could get. Because here, you have a very short period of time. You have within hours of the statement being made, its fulfillment. Now, Peter has denied the possibility that this will happen. So, Jesus says, I tell you, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter says, no way. From the openness perspective, you must say that there is no possible world in which Peter would not deny Jesus 3 times, despite his stated intention not to. It's almost impossible to conceive that Peter could say, even if I will die with you, I will not deny you, and there not be a possible universe in which Peter fulfills that promise. That's what you have to say if you're an open theist, that there is no possible future in which Jesus could have been wrong, or Jesus risks being a false prophet. And that's a particular difficulty too. The statement here isn't, truly I tell you, this very night, you'll probably deny me 3 times. It's that you will. And so this heavily implies that it is definitely set in the future and that will happen. Peter knew the prediction, and open theists must argue there's no world in which Peter keeps his word, and such a statement truly strains credulity. Now, here's a question. Couldn't an open theist turn this around and say, well, how could a God who decreed Saul would be king or humanity be created regret those things? Like we saw, I'm sorry I made humanity. I regret that I made Saul king. So in the same way that we'll say, how could the open God make these statements? They could say, how could the definite foreknowledge God regret things? How would you respond? It's a good question. And this is where you can get into my proof text can beat up your proof text kind of discussion. So the principle that I'm going to give is that the best response is that the explicit teaching of Scripture always triumphs over the implicit teaching of Scripture, regardless of our understanding or how to harmonize them. What I mean is this. Every text that we've just talked about is a statement within a particular context. An explicit text, something that's declarative, something that is on a particular topic, like God's attributes. God is this, or what it means to be God is that. Includes definite knowledge of the future, for instance. If there's a statement like that, and there is, that triumphs over all of our understanding of what these other passages mean. We may not quite know how to harmonize them, but if there was a text that said God does not know the future explicitly, we would have to interpret the cock crowing 3 times in light of the straightforward statement, God does not know the future. That's because even though we'd say, well, God must know the future because he said Peter would deny him 3 times, and he did. Well, there's another text that's explicit saying God doesn't know the future. So now we need a different way of understanding that. Turn that around. If there are explicit texts that say God does indeed know the future, that means it is about God. God is the subject. The topic of the passage is on God's attributes and God's foreknowledge, and that is responded to in the affirmative. Then that's the dominant idea, and we have to go with that, and we have to live in some tension of trying to understand what is being communicated in those other passages. So we might see something and draw a conclusion about God's character from it, but if there's an existing text that makes a descriptive statement about God's character, we go with that even if we don't know how they work together. So let's talk about a few more passages that talk about God's knowledge of the future. Daniel chapter 4, 34 through 45. This is Nebuchadnezzar after he's gone insane and come back again. For his, that's Yahweh's sovereignty, is an everlasting sovereignty, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing. And he, Yahweh, does what he wills with the host of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can stay his hand or say to him, what are you doing? So, God does what God wills with both the hosts of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. Psalm 33. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the peoples. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the thoughts of his heart to all generations. So, here's an interesting contrast in parallelism here in Psalm 33. The counsel of the nations and the plans of the peoples are frustrated by God. But God's counsel stands forever. The thoughts of his heart are over all generations. So, people make plans, and God thwarts them. God makes plans, and nobody thwarts his. God's exercising his will in creation. This one's probably the other knockdown text against this position. I am God, there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my purpose shall stand, and I will fulfill my intention. This one here, so declaring the end from the beginning, from ancient times, things not yet done. So it's from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my purpose shall stand, I will fulfill my intention. That is definite writing of the future. So, and I am God, there is no one like me. So, and this is where it gets interesting. Isaiah, both here and in the trial of the false gods, which we'll look at in a second, is, couching this idea, declaring the end from the beginning, saying from ancient times things not yet done, within the idea that I am God, there is no other. Which means this is an attribute of God. There's no one like me who can declare the end from the beginning. There's no one like me who can talk about what will come from ancient times past. There's no one like me whose purpose will stand. There's no one like me who can fulfill my intention. I am God. So Godness here is described not exhaustively, but explicitly as the ability to know future events and to fulfill one's intention. This actually goes back to Psalm 139 as one of these texts. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me when none of them as yet existed. Once again, this is now a personal. This isn't just a just one that somebody could argue about Isaiah 46. Well, that's just talking about one particular set of events. Here's a personal prayer that's then incorporated into corporate worship. That's all people are now to pray. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. This is supposed to be a prayer that any individual can say. Numbers 23:19. Here's another explicit God is. God is not a human being that he should lie, or a mortal that he should change his mind. Has he promised and will he not do it? Has he spoken, will he not fulfill it? God doesn't change his mind. He has spoken and he will do it. He will fulfill his intentions. He's not subject to, sort of like in Psalm 33, the actions of human beings, because Yahweh frustrates the counsel of the nations, but his plans stand forever. So God knows what's going to happen. God will do it. He does not change his mind. The trial of the false gods from Isaiah, this one we'll want to pull up here because it's particularly strong. So starting in verse 21. Set forth your case, says Yahweh. Bring your proof, says the God of Jacob. Let's see, we need to get some context here. Which is we're looking for where it specifically mentions the idols, because that's what this is about. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, well, you get into it down here. So, bring forth your case, says Yahweh. Bring your proof, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring them and tell us what is to happen. Does it use a noun there in one of the other translations? So yeah, the NIV places it here. Tell us, you idols, what is going to happen. Tell us what the former things were, so that we may consider them and know their final outcome. Or declare to us the things that come. Tell us what the future holds, so we may know that you are gods. That right there, when I talk about an explicit statement, tell us what the future holds, so that we may know that you are gods. The definition of godhood is wrapped up in being able to tell what the future holds. Indeed, do anything good or bad, so some will be dismayed and filled with fear, but you are less than nothing. Your works are worthless. Whoever chooses you is detestable, is abominable. Toeva. I, on the other hand, have stirred up one from the north, and he comes from the rising sun, who calls my name. He treads on rulers as if they were mortar. As if he were potter treading the clay. Who told of this from the beginning, so we could know, or beforehand we could say he was right? No one told of this. No one foretold it. No one heard any words from you, idols. I was the first to tell Zion, look, they are here. I gave to Jerusalem a messenger of good news. But I looked that there is no one among the gods to give counsel, no one to give an answer when I asked them. See, they are all false. Their deeds amount to nothing. Their images are but wind and confusion. So, this is about as explicit as it gets. And I don't see how it gets stronger than this in terms of an explicit statement. We tell us what's going to come so that we may know that you are gods. The test of a true God is knowing the future. Nobody heard the words of the false gods accomplishing their wills or predicting their futures. And one other that I guess I should have put on here was tell us what the future holds so that we may know that you are gods. I guess that is on there. One other quote that we can add in here too, Ephesians 1:11, God works all things according to the counsel of his will. So it's not just an Old Testament idea, it's a New Testament idea too. Now, let's go through all the passages that explicitly state that God does not know the future, because we have to consider those too. So this first one, I think you're familiar with. You might know this one too. There's these as well. And then I think there's a couple more. That might be the last one. But there you go. There are no texts that say explicitly God does, just like we saw with right there, tell us the future things so we know that you are gods. Or God is not a man that he changes, that he should change his mind. These things that are very explicit about the nature of godhood. We don't see that God does not know the future passages. We don't say God never interacts with human beings in a way that when he's talking to a prophet saying, like, I don't know what's going to happen. In fact, even one of the things I want to get at, I guess, here perhaps in Isaiah's call, there we can see behind the scenes a little bit in Isaiah's call. Let's take a look there at Isaiah's call, Isaiah chapter 6. So this is the, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? This is in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord of hosts on a high and lofty throne. So this is the commissioning of Isaiah the prophet. Isaiah says, "Here I am, send me." And Yahweh says, "Go to the people, be hearing but never understanding, but seeing never perceiving. Make the hearts of the people calloused, make their ears dull, close their eyes, otherwise they might see and hear and understand, and turn and be healed." Just because there's a prophet sent doesn't mean that there's an expectation of repentance. Why does that matter to this discussion? Because it can look like God is doing something and being thwarted or being surprised or not necessarily knowing what's going on in time, when God's intention in sending Isaiah was to dull the minds of the people and not actually accomplish repentance. So God's intentions are not always readily accessed from a direct reading of the text, which is why you need the explicit statements, and there are none here. Okay, but still, how can God, I can hear somebody saying, fine, okay, I get it, but how am I supposed to understand these regret passages? How can he actually regret doing something he knew were decreed? Now, most commentators say that this is anthropomorphizing language. This is making, the way that Calvin or Augustine would talk about it, God has to lisp to us. He's to speak to us as a small child because we are time-bound. We couldn't possibly understand, sort of like what Psalm 139 says, "This is too great for me. I do not understand your knowledge." This is a possibility. It could be that there's no real way for us to understand, especially within time, how can a timeless thing make sense when we're bound in time. And so, that is a possibility. John Walton argues, at least about the Genesis example, that the Hebrew word is more about taking and accounting than it is about regret. So God weighs the balances of human beings, finds them wanting, and feels a moral duty to react to rectify the imbalance that's been created. So he is unhappy about the imbalance, and it feels compelled to act. It's an interesting idea. Walton finds himself on kind of an island there, as far as I know. That said, I think that perspective is relatively new, so I'm not sure. John Piper argues that this is similar to disciplining children. You wish you didn't have to do it, but you do it anyway because it's the right thing. As much as I like Pastor Piper, I don't find this convincing. In particular, I don't find that convincing because this is precisely what the word regret is supposed to mean. This is supposed to mean, I didn't like it. If you say, about disciplining your children, I didn't like it, but I don't regret it. What you mean is, you didn't like doing it at the time, but there was a greater good for it. And so, even though you had to hold your nose and do it, you did it anyway because it was the thing that you had to do, or the thing that you felt like you needed to do. That's the idea behind regret. To use the word regret means that you truly are sorry that, in fact, you did it. And so I don't think that gets us around the emotion of regret. Regret would not be the word that's used at that point. So I wouldn't use that as an argument in this particular case. I think the anthropomorphizing language is perhaps the best and broadest attested language that we have, which is that given our perspective, stuck in time, we can't understand a timeless being. We perceive things in time. And in a way, my wife put it this way the other day, and I thought this was particularly elegant. She said, God's allowed to be a character in his own play. And, it reminded me like Hitchcock was in like all of his movies at one point. And I do think that's true. I think there's a drama in redemption. I think we are left to see how God acts, and God does need to act certain ways in time in order to make certain points and illustrate certain things. And so I do think that God has carved out a small role, small speaking part for him in a few places in order to add to the drama of the story. How can God change his mind? It's another good question. Did God really change his mind about Israelites with Moses, or about the destruction of Nineveh and Jonah? That would be another good example. Like when we read the text and it said, Moses pleaded with God and God changed his mind. Is that real? Or are we dealing with a text that is kind of jerking us around a bit, I guess? This is not just a challenge about providence. It's a challenge of God's having knowledge of future events at all. Only a being that can acquire new information can ever change his or her mind, would be the idea. So, an open theist perspective would say that God's changing of his mind shows that new information had to be added. If new information had to be added, that means it was not known. If it was not known, then God does not have definite knowledge of all future contingent events. So what would be the answer? The first, I think, and this is, I get a little frustrated on both of these examples. The first response, God has been transparent about his disposition in these cases, such as in the covenant blessings and curses and provisions for repentance in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28. It is absolutely within God's character to pronounce judgment upon the unrepentant and then grace and salvation for the repentant. It is not changing of God's mind if Israel is disobedient and they are under curses, and then Israel repents and now they are restored to blessing. Same thing with Nineveh. Nineveh repents. Their status before God has now changed. Was God going to destroy them if they were unrepentant? And then they repented. The rules of the game haven't changed. It's a description of the status of the nation before God. Not necessarily that God has new information now that caused a change in his being or a change in his intention. God is not affected that way. All it is just God executing out the decree that he has set, which is those that are repentant will receive grace, and those that are unrepentant receive judgment. So now in the Exodus example, I think that Moses, as the representative of Israel, is essentially allowed to plead on their behalf. And I think God grants Moses that agency as the leader and representative of Israel in that case. But I don't think it's fair to say that God changed his mind about the destruction of Nineveh in the same way that somebody might change their mind about a politician that they voted for. Then they see how the politician acts and they want to throw him out. It's not the same thing. Another response would be God ordains the means as well as the ends. Sometimes the means by which a story is told, like the story of Jonah, is that it seems like God changes his mind. In fact, when you go into Jonah, we see that the story is so much more about Jonah than it is about Nineveh. Jonah almost spits the tripartite promise back at God and says, I didn't want to do this because I knew that you are slow to anger and abounding in steadfast loving kindness and truth. I knew that your character was like this, God, and that you wouldn't crush all those nasties in there. Jonah is brought to repentance, so to speak, and is growing in his knowledge through watching what happens in his life and then how God's disposition changes at repentance. I think that this is the idea behind prayer as well. Do we really think that we are changing God with our prayers? Like there's some kind of prayer that we can pray that would somehow make what God believed to be the case moments before the prayer, change. Really? Really? I submit to you that if that's the case, I submit to you that you would have a whole lot of evidence that you're going to need to explain, a whole lot of negative evidence where that doesn't happen, and then a whole lot of special pleading where you'd say, well, you just didn't pray right. And there's absolutely no way to know how to reconcile that. As soon as you go the route that says your prayers can change God, you have to look at the cases where there were just massive amounts of people praying for a particular thing that never happened. You can't actually hold that opinion, and then, well, maybe you can. I was about to say, you also, I guess I'll put it this way, you also need to give God the freedom to say no in terms of answering the prayer. But as soon as God can answer no to the prayer, now you're dealing with, well, why does God say yes in some cases and no in other cases? It becomes incredibly complex, which is why the Reformed view has always been that the prayers are about are the means by which somebody's conformed to the image of Christ. So, does God change his mind? No, but it sometimes looks like it to make a point. Then, okay, but still, if God knew everything that was going to happen, including sin, isn't God responsible for evil? So this is another. I'm not going to say that the openness advocates got to their position because of the problem of evil or suffering, but they certainly will bring it up as saying this is actually a resolution to the problem of evil and suffering too, because God is actually working within constraints, and he's doing his best to play the chess master move, knowing that there's still some probabilities out there, and there will be some dramatically unexpected black swan type events that will happen that he's going to have to contend with. This is a great question. This is a question, by the way, that does need to be understood properly. It's not just that this is a problem for the Reformed God who decreed everything that would happen, because you have the God that decrees the future that includes sin, and everybody understands how that's a problem. But then you have the bypasser, or the observer God, who apparently is powerful enough to intervene but chooses not to. And so either God actually has to contend with this problem. The only God that doesn't have to contend with this particular problem is the God of open theism. So the answer differs here based on one's notion of free will. If we choose to ignore natural evil for a second, the answer differs based on how one understands free will. So there's two types of free will that we're going to talk about. Libertarian free will, which is a person can do whatever he or she wants to do, and the person's wants or desires are independent of external influence. By that I mean, when I talk about external influence, I guess they are not determined by outside factors. So this is full ability to choose, and the wants or desires of a particular person are not externally determined. Compatibilistic free will, a person can do whatever he or she wants to do, but they cannot affect what they want to do. This is Jonathan Edwards would have advocated for that. This formulation is a paraphrase of Schopenhauer's explanation, which was that a man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills, which is the idea of compatibilistic freedom. As long as an agent is free to act on whatever will they have, whatever desire they have, they are considered free, even if their desires are externally determined. Be compatibilistic freedom. Libertarian makes sense. Compatibilistic means that it's a view of freedom that's also compatible with deterministic universe. So, some biblical examples here. Genesis 50:20, I think, is a particularly important one. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. If we look at the if we look at the passage here, so this is about Joseph's brothers. Remember, Joseph's brothers sold him up the river, and he ended up in Egypt. He ends up being promoted to the executive director of Egypt, office below Pharaoh. And there's a famine in Israel. His brothers come back to try and get food. Joseph actually had gotten in charge and stored up enough food to make it through the famine. At the very end here of Genesis, there's Joseph knows who his brothers are, even though his brothers don't recognize him. And so this is where there's finally the recognition by the brothers that Joseph is who he says he is. And so let's see, we get to the passage. They're begging for Joseph's forgiveness. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" And so they, skipping to verse 18, his brothers came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended me harm, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." All right, so in that example, we have one action, the intentions of Joseph's brothers being evil, the intention of God being good, the saving of many lives. So we'll just hold that there. Isaiah chapter 10. So Isaiah chapter 10, we'll go there. This is a woe oracle on Assyria. It takes a little bit of reading, but let's, and I'll actually, we're going to use the Holman. "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger." Now the speaker here, we need to identify the speaker real quick. Let's throw the speaker labels on here. And the speaker labels aren't showing up. I don't know why not. The speaker here is Yahweh. So, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my wrath." Okay, this is God. God's saying, woe. So he's pronouncing a woe oracle on Assyria. Okay, but Syria is the rod of my anger. The staff in their hands is my wrath. So he's pronouncing a woe oracle on the people who are representing his anger and his wrath. "I will send him, Assyria, against a godless nation, Israel. I will command him to go against a people destined for my rage." That's Israel. So I am sending Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff of my wrath, against Israel, to take spoils and to plunder and to trample them down in the clay in the streets. Okay, but woe is what's being pronounced on them. Hold that right there. But this is not what he intends, he being Assyria. So woe to these Assyrians who are working out my wrath against Israel, because this is not what they intend. This is not what they plan. They want to destroy. So I want them to take spoils and plunder. They want to destroy and to cut off many nations. For he says, "Aren't all my commanders kings?" We'll skip in verse 9. "As my hand seized the idolatrous kingdoms, whose idols exceeded those of Jerusalem and Samaria, as I did to Samaria and its idols, and will I not also do to Jerusalem and its idols?" So this is the pomp and haughtiness of the king of Assyria. "But when the Lord finishes his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem." Okay, again, Assyria is being brought up against Israel by God. God is the one who's commanding them to go forward. "But when the Lord finishes his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for his arrogant acts and the proud look in his eyes. For he said, I have done this by my own strength and wisdom, for I am clever. I abolished the borders of nations and plundered their treasures like a mighty warrior. I subjugated the inhabitants. My hand has reached out as if into a nest to seize the wealth of the nations like one gathering abandoned eggs. I gathered the whole earth, and no wing fluttered, and no beak opened or chirped." So that's the quote of the king of Assyria. And God says, even though Assyria is going up against Israel at God's command, he's going to punish Assyria. Why? For their intention that we just described. After all, verse 15, does an axe exalt itself over the one who chops with it? Does a saw magnify itself over the one who saws with it? It would be like a staff waving the one who lifts it. It would be like a rod lifting a man who isn't wood. Therefore, the Lord God of hosts will inflict an emaciating disease on the well-fed of Assyria. He will kindle a burning fire under its glory. So, this is an incredible passage. This is like, and truly theologically incredibly deep. So, Assyria is the rod of Yahweh's anger. It is the instrument against Israel. However, Assyria had poor intentions to destroy, and God will punish them for their arrogant boasting. Shall the axe vaunt itself over the one who wields it? So it's not the action that they're getting punished for, but the intent. The action is actually part of God's righteous judgment against Israel, but he's still holding Assyria accountable. Why? For their intent. So we're seeing the working out here of something that is, God can have good purposes behind actions that have the evil intent of human beings. And so God is insulated, so to speak, from the unrighteous intent behind the evil act, because in these cases they are all achieving his ends, either in Genesis 50, the saving of many lives, or in Isaiah 10, the judgment upon Israel. So if we're truly dead in our trespasses and sins, we require a change of our heart in order to repent. We are not in control of our desires. This is more consistent with compatibilism, the biblical teaching about a corrupt nature that must be changed by God, as are the passages that we just went over, which seem to be talking about not libertarian actions, but that God has an intention in what's being carried out in time, and that intention he can have his holy and righteous intention for it, but the desires of the people involved can be evil. And that one action can have multiple intentions, which is more of a compatibilistic idea. So under compatibilism, the idea that God being the author of sin is not the case, because the intentions of the people are the sins that they are responsible for, even if the action had its own righteous intent behind it. So, a philosophical question with this. If God created knowing the possibility of evil but could not predict or affect how much evil occurred, doesn't God bear some liability for the evil that happens? This is the idea of the God who looks down the corridors of time. That God can't say what we just read, which is that there is a good intention of God's behind the evil action of men. That God has to react. And I've always wondered this about the whole God can bring good out of evil thing. If God can bring good out of evil, why doesn't God just bring good? Why does it always have to be out of evil? Why does God have to play around with, why is evil the constant and then God is reacting to evil? That is only consistent in an open theistic idea. You have to be an open theist to care about or to say God can bring good out of evil. And mean that in the sense that God can take things that free human beings do and turn it into something good. The meticulous providence view, the compatibilistic freedom view, is the other one that can contend with this, because they say the things that are seen as evil actions may have evil and sinful intentions behind them. There is a purpose of God's that is righteous and holy and pure that happens as a result. So the God that has eternally decreed all things at least has a purpose in whatever we see as evil. The open view of God is one that is surprised by some of the evil in the world. This God, however, is probably full of regrets. Seems to have considerably misplayed his hand in the 20th century. So even though the open God can say, well, I'm not responsible for evil, you can say, for being infinitely smart, you don't seem that smart. There's lots of things that we could see where God could have made something happen differently. Hitler, the rise of the Third Reich, Stalin. Did we really have to wait for the arms race in the 80s to get rid of the Soviet Union and the evils therein? Was that really the best possible chess moves that could be made? That God might say black swan, a whole bunch of improbable things happen. In which case, that God is not particularly trustworthy. You might be playing with the best bridge player ever, but if you've got the handful of numbers, you're going to lose the hand. So this God is of no use whatsoever in the discussion of the problem of evil and suffering. it might save God from culpability, but then evil is now this extrinsic force that can take us anywhere. The whole thing could be wiped out. We are truly balanced on a razor's edge, and God could just be like, huh. Was God during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Was God sitting there, teeth chattering, trying to, play the best hand that he possibly could? He's like, this is more likely than not the end of the road. What kind of God is that? Is that the God that predicts the end from the beginning? This is not a God worth worshiping or glorifying. So, in summary, the explicit statements of Scripture about God's character when addressing the subject of God's character are primary. We can look at those declarative statements as authoritative, and we must interpret all statements in light of these declarations. There is no such thing as purposeless evil. God has intentions in all actions, even if they are not the same as human intentions. And God did indeed know everything about us when we were formed in the womb, as stated in Psalm 139. So this brings us to the end of a select theological exposition of the Psalms. I hope you enjoy it, and I look forward to doing Bible Geeks again in the future. I bless you in all your studies. Take care.